Well, okay, that's kind of. I think that was. I think that's brought a hush. So.
Are we operating hybrid?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Oh, brilliant. Is it- so much Oh, you're right.
Yes, I believe.
There were 2 ones with a green light.
Yes.
Yeah. Avoid temptation.
Good, that'd be great.
I'm not going to say that.
Okay.
I know, I'm like, Right, that sounds like my cue to introduce everything. It's really amazing to see everybody here. My name is Jane Green. I'm from Nuffield College in Oxford. I'm part of the British Election Study team, and I'm also part of the ITV News election team. So obviously a year to go is very, very timely and exciting for me to be here. I'm really looking forward to hearing both what the speakers have to say, what other people have to say, and to getting to know as many of you as possible, although there are really a lot of you here today. So probably won't get a chance to do that, but isn't that fantastic? That's really great. So British Polling Council, I know, are delighted to host this inaugural. Perhaps it will continue, we shall see. But I'm going to pass over to the first panel, and we are going to be reflecting on the mood out there with a year to go. And John Curtis is going to speak to us first on 1 year to go, precisely. And I'll hand over to John. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. As you will have gathered, we're going to start this early career research afternoon with a rather late career researcher, but very kindly they asked me to speak. I've really got 1 or 2 important housekeeping things to say. First of all, welcome to you from the British Polling Council, whose president I currently am and have been for a rather long time. And at our AGM back in January, February this year, we were reflecting on the fact that some of you may have attended it. We had a conference last October, November, in which, shall we say, quite a lot of those of us who've been around for a rather long time in the polling world were presenting. And it was suggested that we now ought to do something that meant that those who are doing valuable work inside the polling and social research world, but who so far perhaps have not had a great deal of public profile, should have the chance to be able to demonstrate their capacities and interests. So that's the aim of this afternoon. And I'm just, first of all, just delighted to see so many here, and doubtless there are many people also watching online. I think probably you've already managed to get a bigger audience than we did last year, so well done. There are various people I need to thank. I need to thank Patrick Sturgis and the LSE for allowing us to have this room and, shall we say, keeping off the bureaucracy who were wanting to begin to charge us far too much for it. Thank you very much, Patrick. It's very kind of you. I need to say a great thanks to Simon Atkinson. I largely organised last year's conference, and this year I said to my fellow officers, why don't one of you have a go at it? And Simon very kindly volunteered, so I'm really grateful to him. I'm grateful to Jane for agreeing to chair this afternoon's session, not least because I have to apologise that I need to disappear at about 3:15, both because of other events going on at Westminster today and also because I'm giving a talk in Oxford at 6 o'clock. But can I also thank in particular the young early career researchers who actually, under Simon's guidance, organised today. We said if we're going to have an early careers conference, then it should be run by those early careers. So I need to say a big thanks to Joe Adler from JL Partners, Holiday from Ipsos, Beth Mann from YouGov, Jack Peacock from Survation, and Finton Smith from YouGov. And of course, big thanks to also to all their line managers for allowing them to spend time on getting this organized. And I hope that all the organizations will agree that the experience and the exposure today will be something from which not only they will benefit, but also their employers. So anyway, what I was asked to talk about was a little bit, this is the kind of headline stuff about, where is the public now? Where is the mood out there? Now, of course, it's a big topic. So I thought I'd focus on the position of the Conservatives. I'm not really going to talk about the Labour Party. And I'm really going to try to address the question that, given the Conservatives are 20 points behind in the opinion polls, which is, can they close the gap, and can they close the gap sufficiently that they might even manage to win a 5th term? I guess the subtext of this is to give you some idea of how both commercial polling research, and I'm also going to use some of the data that Jane and her colleagues are responsible for with the British election study, to give you an idea of how polling data can be informative in helping us to be able to understand where the public are at, and therefore what are the prospects of the parties. I'll tell you straight now, I'm not going to predict the outcome of the next election, and who knows what's going to happen, but hopefully what we can do is to get some idea of what are the things that are likely to matter in the next 12 months, events aside, and that therefore perhaps give us a better understanding of where we're going on. First of all, a quick reminder about this Parliament, which electorally has been a somewhat unusual Parliament. As it were, the standard story that we often tell about parliaments is that the government has a bit of a honeymoon at the beginning, and then it begins to hit trouble, and the opposition usually gets ahead. The extent to which it gets ahead varies from parliament to parliament. Then by this stage, we're going, well, will the government, are the government beginning to catch up, and will they manage to get back to the winning post or not? It's now very, very easily forgotten that for the first 2 years of this Parliament, the Conservatives were never, ever consistently behind Labour in the opinion polls. How different a world we were in not so long ago. But then along came the first stories about Partygate, and support for the Conservatives basically fell by about 6 points in 6 weeks. 2, then along came Liz Truss and her fiscal event, and support for the Conservatives went down by another 6 points in roughly 6 weeks. And you can see it there with the crossover point, the point where Labour go ahead in the polls the first time is the immediate wake of Partygate, although things were narrowing beforehand. And then you can see the impact of Liz Truss. And then what you can also see is that despite now having had Rishi Sunak for 12 months, who was meant to be there because he was more popular than his party, and that therefore his popularity would rub off on his party, basically, they're exactly where they were 12 months ago. It's still 20 points. They had a little bit of improvement, and then they failed to get behind the Privilege Committee report on Boris Johnson misleading the House of Commons, and basically threw away whatever progress they'd already had, because, as I will show you, people are still concerned about Boris Johnson and lockdown. One way of addressing this, apart from looking the timeline of addressing this question, is indeed to look and see, this is a piece of polling that Public First have done, in which they ask people, what do you think of the things that the Conservatives have done that are bad, right? They did, by the way, also ask about the things that are good, but it's just not relevant to this talk. And you can see there, first of all, issues of leadership, Liz Truss gets mentioned, and the lockdown parties get mentioned. They're in the top half dozen things that people complained about. The NHS is on the list, as is also economics and the cost of living. So clearly, the economy we need to look at, the NHS we need to look at, leadership we need to look at. Brexit's there, but to be honest, it's much more complained about by people who aren't voting Conservatives, but we'll say a little bit about that. And then you'll also notice the immigration. But one thing you notice about immigration is that it's very much something that Conservative voters complain about rather than the rest of the public. Though that, of course, could mean it's particularly difficult for the Conservatives, but we will come back to that. Okay, so leadership. Well, unfortunately, rather than Mr. Sunak dragging his party up, his party, or other things, his circumstances, his style of leadership, whatever you prefer, has helped to drag him down. This is YouGov's occasional set of questions about favourability, and they often ask it in the same polls. And as you can see now, Mr. Sunak is almost as unpopular as his party, whereas the gap that certainly existed when he first became Prime Minister is now virtually disappeared. Although, of course, even by autumn of last year, Sunak was an awful lot less popular than he had been prior to the revelation about his wife's non-dom status and his own long-running green card for the United States. So we needed to look at the economy. This is, by the way, if you look at Ipsos data on economic optimism, which they ask every month, this has been the most economically pessimistic 4 years we have had. It was a brief period in 2021 and when we were beginning to get out of lockdown, when the public thought things were getting better, but otherwise they have been pessimistic for more, for longer, and they are still pretty pessimistic now, even though the economy has begun to improve. But as you can see, also from here, this is YouGov's data. The public, there's a bit of improvement from the worst of Liz Truss, but the public are still not proving very willing, inclined to say, actually, the government is now beginning to handle things better. Indeed, you need to understand that amongst 2019 Conservative voters on this time series, 55% of them still think the government is handling the economy badly. So you can see how the economy, even though there's been some improvement in the objective data during the course of the last 6 months or so, the economy is still dogging the Conservatives, and this does matter. This is British election study data. There is more than one question they've been asking. I think this is probably the best one, although they've not asked it all the time. But this is a question which is closest to the Ipsos question, which is, how well do you think the economy is currently doing? So it's not just retrospective, and it's not obviously looking to the future, but it's kind of saying, well, where are we heading? And what I'm doing here, and I'm going to do this more than once on a number of issues, is to show you the probability that a 2019 Conservative voter will say that they will vote Conservative again, separately according to whether they think the economy is doing better, it's okay, a little worse, or a lot worse. Now, the first thing you do need to realize is that there are these two blocks represent many more people than those two blocks. But what you can then also see is that there's a very clear relationship. People, Conservative 2019 voters who are deeply pessimistic about the economy are markedly less likely to say they will vote Conservative again. So the economy matters. And if the Conservatives are going to recover in the polls, they therefore almost undoubtedly will need to persuade the public that the economy is better and that they deserve credit for it and they can manage it well in future. And obviously that is in part what today's autumn statement attempts to be about. Although if you look at the actual growth figures that the Chancellor announced, you kind of go, well, yes, we'll see, maybe. Anyway, a second subject, indeed the subject that was top of my list, was the NHS. This is data from British Social Attitudes, which I have some responsibility for. This is showing you the levels of satisfaction and dissatisfaction with the health service all the way back to 1983. We basically grumbled during the Thatcher and Major years about the health service. Labour then eventually turned on the spending taps, put in lots of targets, got the waiting times down, high levels of satisfaction, which survived most of the Cameron-Osborne era. Along came the pandemic, and we are now more dissatisfied than ever with, of course, record levels of waiting lists. And if we do the same analysis, again using BES data, we can see that people who are 2019 Conservative voters who are pessimistic about the NHS of whom there are a great many indeed, are much less likely to say they will vote Conservative again. So this also suggests that it's going to be difficult for the Conservatives to make progress in the polls unless they can significantly reduce waiting times and therefore levels of satisfaction with the NHS. And of course, on that particular Prime Ministerial target, things have been going backwards during the course of this year rather than forwards. Now, the other thing that we're not talking about, and particularly in the light of today, is about the size of the state. And of course, one of the things that's happened during this Parliament is that the state has grown to record levels. We now have record levels of taxation, record levels of spending. It was the rebellion against that that was the principal foundation of Liz Truss's success back in the leadership contest in the summer. But where are the public? This is British Social Attitudes' long-term time series asking people whether or not taxes and spending should go up, spending on things like health and education, whether they should say it is now or whether it should be reduced. Very few people ever say reduced. This is where the action is. The grey line are the people who think it should increase, and the orange line who think it should keep it as now. Now, hitherto, these data have followed what Chris Verlazen in the States described as a thermostatic reaction. So in the 80s and 90s, as waiting times went up, and as the government tried to keep pressure down on public spending, although it wasn't always that successful, gradually the public said, our health service isn't working properly, our schools are not good enough, we need to increase spending. And I've already said, eventually Labour got the message. But then, of course, you can't satisfy the public, right? If you do that and you give them brilliant schools and fantastic health service, they then say, hang on, you're taking too much tax off me. And you can see the reaction. And so when we get to the Cameron Osborne era of austerity, it was in tune, roughly speaking, as to where the public had moved to. But before the pandemic, we had already begun to rebel against austerity. But here is now the fascinating bit. Despite the fact that in this Parliament, taxation and spending have grown more than in any previous post-war Parliament, there is, as yet at least, no sign of a reaction amongst the public against the growth in the size of the state. It leaves open the question, to which we don't know the answer yet, as to whether or not as a society we are now, in the light of the experience of the pandemic, move towards saying, well, actually, maybe we do need a bigger state. Or, of course, it could just simply be the fact that people are not going to be looking for tax cuts until the public services are working better than they think they are. Because the point is, we reacted here once the public services were doing better. So that, I think, is a question for the future. Again, just in case you don't want to believe British Social Attitudes, this is Opinium's data over the last couple of years. This gets a different balance of answers, but the crucial point is that over the long run of the last 2 years, again, there isn't any sign of a reaction amongst the public away from increased spending. If anything, it's gone up more recently. So that certainly raises questions about whether or not the strategy on which the government has now begun to embark today of trying to say we are a low tax party, ignore our record, will work or not. The other thing, of course, on which the government has been trying to focus, and again, it was on my list of items earlier, was the question of immigration and trying to reduce levels of particularly illegal immigration and stop the votes. So let's look at the relationship between people's perceptions of this and the probability that 2019 Conservative voters will say they'll vote Conservative again. So these are the folk who think that immigration is now lower, this is legal immigration, about the same, a little higher, or a lot higher. It's not much doing here. There isn't much obvious relationship. There are lots of Conservatives who think it's too high, but their disloyalty is not significantly greater than all of these other groups. I have to use a different source to do this for illegal immigration, but you get a very similar story. Very little difference between perceptions of illegal immigration and probability of defecting from the Conservatives. Now, of course, it may be true that even though immigration and perception of immigration do not seem to be central to the story of why the Conservatives are where they are, that stopping the votes might still produce an actual benefit. We can't rule that possibility. But we have to be aware that in focusing on immigration, the government is focusing on a subject where, yes, there is plenty of discontent amongst their core voters, but does not seem to lie behind the reasons why they are in the polls. So it does at least raise questions as to whether or not their strategy makes sense. Brexit was on the list. It is true that those people who changed their minds about Brexit, who are no less likely to vote Conservative, but there aren't that many of them. So, it's a relative footnote. But what is worth looking at in terms of Brexit, and this is the point at which I'm going to stop, because it gives you an idea of how, not because of Brexit, but the events and difficulties that the government has faced, which I've tried to outline, how it has fractured the coalition of voters who voted Conservative in 2019. 80% of those people who in 2019 were in favour of being outside the EU voted for the Conservatives. The equivalent figure now, and this is based on people's current preference, it's no good now to look at what people did back in 2016 because too many people have changed their minds. But amongst those who are currently in favour of being outside the EU, which is a somewhat smaller group than it was 4 years ago, support for the Conservatives is on average in the opinion polls down by 32 points. And it's the fracturing of that coalition that in the end is the Conservatives' fundamental problem. The problems this government has faced and people's perceptions of how they handled it has not been enough to keep the coalition that Boris Johnson brought together loyal to the Conservative Party. So, what do the Tories have to do? Provide us with leadership, of course. Get the economy right, of course. Get better public services, of course. Oh yeah, and if they could sell Brexit a bit more successfully, that would help as well. None of these things look terribly easy, but they do look to be necessary. The things on which the Conservatives seem to want to focus, well, maybe, but it's not obvious that these are the issues that are going to rescue the Conservatives. And final note, I had reason to write about the 1997 election recently, and I was reminded that in both 1995 and in 1996, the Conservatives reduced income tax, and much good it did them.
Amazing. It's always reassuring to me when I'm thinking something that John's thinking. And this point about the Conservatives being on issues that aren't going to benefit them is a point that I've been thinking about and talking about. What we're going to do is we're going to just go straight over to Cameron Garrett and to Ben Roth. And then at the end of these three presentations, we're going to invite all the speakers up to the front and then we'll take all of the questions. So I know you'll all have questions for John, so if you could just park those for a bit and then we'll hand over to Cameron and Ben. Thank you so much. And they're talking about the long-term view from Ipsos, with Ipsos data, I imagine.
Yes. Thank you, Jane. As Jane said, my name is Cameron Garrett. I'm a research manager at Ipsos and I'm joined today.
I'm Ben, research exec at Ipsos.
So no pressure following up John, but it's great to see so many here. So Ipsos, oh sorry, 2 seconds. Ipsos, formerly known as Mori, have been doing political polling in the UK since the late 1970s. So we have kind of a wealth of data to be using from, and we're one of the only pollsters that are still doing telephone polling. And so we do it a bit slower. We do it monthly. And what we've done in today's presentation is we've wrapped up some of those months to work out some averages across the year. And we're going to use some of those trends to tell us what they can inform us about the likely outcome of the next election. I won't be dwelling too much on voting intention today, but just to give you context for the wider polling that we're going to be discussing, Ipsos also show a 21-point lead for the Labour Party, and it's kind of reassuringly followed the patterns which John outlined, kind of neck and neck at some points. Partygate happens, Labour have a lead, and then Truss as PM, the lead gets bigger and it's been sustained. So reassuringly following the patterns of the wider polling industry. But what's been driving the lead? Is it Labour strength or Tory weakness? So I'm going to start by showing Keir Starmer's ratings, and if all my builds work, I'll be very happy. So Starmer's ratings, where is he? He started off, as most politicians do, being quite popular when he first come in, when people don't really know too much about him on his net satisfaction. And actually, his first ever rating, I think, was Ipsos's most popular leader of the opposition that we ever measured. He was just above Blair's peaks at the start. But as people got to know him, things quickly change. And he dropped down to around -30. You see a bit of recovery when Liz Truss is Prime Minister. He gets up to nearing the positive mark, but it's kind of dropped off again, showing satisfaction ratings are also are affected by events too. So that's where he's at. And I'm just going to lay over now Tony Blair. So this was him in the mid-90s. His satisfaction ratings, you can see he never dropped into negatives. And that's when he then went to win a landslide in 97. And then again, David Cameron. You can see David Cameron had a more of a checkered history, and he does drop down quite low here, and that's when Gordon Brown becomes Prime Minister. But under the, should he have called an election then? Big question on podcasts at the minute. But as the 2008 financial crisis happened, he comes into net territory, and that's kind of sustained until the 2010 election. So of the leaders of the opposition in the past 40 odd years, the ones that have successfully made it into number 10 have had positive net satisfaction ratings. Not great for Starmer looking at that. And then because I couldn't get my builds to work, I start again. And there's Starmer's ratings. And I'm going to lay over Miliband's now. So, and then Kinnock's and Haig's. So Miliband, Kinnock and Haig, all obviously leaders of the opposition that didn't win an election. And at roughly the same point into their leadership, Starmer seems to be tracking them quite closely. So if you were just looking at these numbers in isolation, it wouldn't be an exactly positive story for Starmer. You wouldn't necessarily say this is a guy with a 21-point lead who's looking likely to be the next Prime Minister. And you can see, like Miliband, for example, as you got close to 2015, his satisfaction ratings does pick up. So if you can keep stable, maybe towards an election, you will see an uptick. And just to show we didn't favourably pick our leaders of the opposition, we worked out an average for all of them going back, and the average net satisfaction for a leader of the opposition going back to the 70s is -12, and Starmer's on -11, so kind of dead in the pack with Kinnock, but better than, say, Foot in the 80s or Corbyn recently, but way behind where Blair was on +21 on average, and Cameron going on to win. And the public are, it's not just Starmer, the public are also split on whether Labour is ready for government in general. So we regularly ask people whether they agree or disagree, is Labour ready to form the next government? And we've rolled up some averages for leaders. You can see about 2 in 5 agree that the Labour Party under Starmer is ready, and there's around the same proportion disagree. That's an improvement from where Corbyn and Miliband were, where we had majorities disagreeing. So they're not viscerally against the idea of a Labour government now. But again, just to hammer home that point, Cameron and Blair had around half or a majority agreeing. So there's not this overwhelming support for the Labour Party. It's kind of lukewarm. And on perceptions of competency, not much has changed. Ipsos asked people a long list of questions and say, does this apply to the Conservative Party or the Labour Party? And when we asked them whether they're fit to govern, it's fair, the Labour Party is more or less flatlined across the past decade. So 41% said they were fit to govern under Ed Miliband, and it's 34% now. They did see a slight dip under Jeremy Corbyn to 26, but actually that did recover under Jeremy Corbyn as well. So it's been fairly straight. But I've been speaking about the Labour Party a lot without introducing the elephant in the room, the Conservative Party. So this is kind of the hold my beer moment. The Conservative Party fit to govern. It peaked high under David Cameron with 56%, and you kind of had a majority in the first half of the 2010s, and it's slowly dropped since then to a low point of 16% under Liz Truss, and it's only barely recovered to 21% now under Sunak. And obviously, looking at Starmer's ratings in isolation are fine, but where is Sunak? He's on -45 in our most recent November polling, 21% satisfied, 66% dissatisfied. And here we've gone through and cherry picked out each of the Prime Minister's worst ever ratings. So this is the lowest they ever got. And you can see these kind of -45 is usually terminal for a Prime Minister. They're on their way out. Look at the dates here. Truss got -51 in September. Johnson -46 in January 2022, gone by the summer. That's May's last ever rating, Cameron's last ever rating. So he should be on his way out the door. And circumstances differ but Sunak has had the worst first year as Prime Minister in 40 odd years. So this is kind of unfair on Sunak because he is the third Prime Minister since the last election. So context is important. But when we roll up the first 12 months of everyone, he's on -30, which, yeah, is the worst one we've had. And obviously he has taken over from Prime Ministers, but you have Brown he was on -16 and then went on to lose. And I think Major's quite interesting here, taken over after over a decade of Tory rule, and he had +25, kind of where Sunak would like to be, but far from it at the minute. And if a PM trials an opposition leader on satisfaction ratings, they tend to lose. So sorry, this is quite a busy chart, but what we've done here is we've worked out the difference between the leader of the opposition's rating and the Prime Minister's rating. And if the Prime Minister is behind, they're below the 0. And if they're leading, they're above the 0. And as you can see here, when they are below, they tend to lose. So Major loses an election, Brown loses an election, and when they're above, they're always winning more or less. And at the minute, Sunak is trailing, so that's not a positive indication for him. But if we're trying to find some glimmer of hope, it's not as bad as Brown and Major. He's behind by 25 points at the minute, and Major and Brown had much more of a deficit to make up. I'm now going to hand over to Ben.
Yeah, that about the government. So just building on what Cameron said, so after 13 years of Conservative government, there's a bit of a sense that it's time for change. People may not be favourable towards Labour, but they're not too favourable towards the current government. So what we've done is, as Cameron mentioned, one of Ipsos's strengths is our trends go back to the 1970s. So what we've done is we've taken the average net satisfaction rating with the government for each year and then worked out the average rating. As you can see, it's not looking too great for Sunak's government in 2023. It's the 4th worst on record. And it's worth saying, it's being in government. People don't like governments. There's a lot of negatives, only 3 positives that coincide with Tony Blair's first few years. And also there was recently 2019, that was Theresa May. That's partly inflated. She has a run of her government, particularly low unsatisfaction ratings towards the end when it was sort of she left. However, the difference is with Sunak, he's had a sustained period of always being in the -60s. The highest rating for his government, net satisfaction rating for his government is -60, which was his first month. And that trend has continued. As you can see, the only other period where there's been a sustained period of -60s was the mid-1990s. And we all know what happened then when the next election arose. And just sort of bring this out, our most recent polling, Political Monitor, so 80% said they were dissatisfied with the government. And just build on themes that have been mentioned already, those people and those groups that might have been trusted in the recent times, the most recent election and in the media as Conservative supporters or Conservative voters, even they are hugely dissatisfied with the current government. So not to go back on what John said, still his thunder, but can the Conservatives turn it around? So just looking at this recent polling we did from September, so asking voters, have you definitely made, of those who said they are going to vote at the next election, have you made up your mind on who you're going to vote for? So you can see at the moment, 50%, so half, said that they might change their mind. And if you look through, obviously, the closer you get to an election, the more likely you are to have decided who you're going to vote for. But the most, I suppose, close comparison we've got is August 2014 into January 2015, about a year, 6 months out from the election in 2015. At that point, it was a bit interchanging leads. Labour started 2014 with slight leads on voting intention. What it shows is that actually come to 2015 elections, the Conservatives won. So there might be room for some voters to change. However, is that going to happen with this election? the things that are going to drive people to make that change are the key policies and issues. And if we look at the things that matter both to the government and to the public think they're doing a bad job, and they thought they were doing a bad job at the start of the year. And if anything, it's only getting worse as we go through. And if we look at those core issues of the cost of living, the NHS, immigration, consistently over 60%, touching on 71% for the NHS, all think they're doing a bad job on these. So John mentioned this earlier, the Economic Optimism Index. So this is a question we ask each month, which is basically asking, do you think perceptions of the economy over the next 12 months? As you can see, it's not quite as bad as last year, but it's still not particularly great. And I think one thing that's worth touching on is, again, a bit like the government, people tend to not think the economy is going too great. If you look at that period in 2014 and 2015, so just there, two of the few positive impressions on the government. So in that time, when perhaps other factors around Cameron's government or him as his personality were not most favourable, they could always fall back on, we're delivering on the economy. Sunak's government's not going to be able to do that. As you can say, even though it's not quite as bad as last year or the run into the 2019 election and 2020, when we obviously had COVID, it's still the 7th worst annual average on record since the question was first asked. And just to wrap up, so really thinking about the things that matter to people, this is a recent thing we've done about public services. They're increasingly important to the public and delivering upon what society wants and needs. As you can see, as time's gone on over the course of, since the Conservatives came to power, now almost 4 in 5 think the government, public services have got worse in the last 5 years. I think what it shows is it's an important issue to people. It links in with that idea of decline over the last 13 years. And there's no easy fixes, as we've seen with today's budget announcements and recent other polling we've done. But I think it's just something that links in with that time. Maybe it is just time for something different, albeit it's not going to be easy to change any of that. And so, yeah, just to conclude, so the public are feeling pessimistic, and particularly pessimistic actually at the moment, and they blame the government for this, which should be good news for Labour, even if they themselves haven't convinced their voters or the wider voting public. Cameron?
Yeah, and with about 1 year to go, it looks likely that Labour will form the next government, but that's going to pose problems for Starmer, as he's going to be the least popular leader of the opposition to ever make it to number 10. So he's not necessarily a popular one when he comes in, and there's going to be no easy answers to fixing public services. Where's the money to spend? They might want it, but are they going to be able to find it? So that might be challenges for him if he makes it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just love some of those graphs. It really just shows you, doesn't it, how like the long-term nature of Ipsos's data can. I'd not noticed the net satisfaction with government being comparable to 93, 94, 95. So that was amazing. Interesting. So we're going to pass straight over to James Blagden from Onward, who has got a title. Come on, James. Come on. I hope you're ready to go. Are you?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. So James's talk is on the politics of place or millennial mindset. So this is the one talk today where I don't know what you're going to say, or at least I can't anticipate some of the content I'm going to say. So over to you, James. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about the millennial generation based on some polling I did for the Onward earlier this year, answering questions around what is this cohort's values, priorities, and some potentially interesting contradictions within that. The difference between, say, their expressed preferences on policy versus their revealed preferences. The difference between what they say they want versus what we can infer they want from other questions in the survey. Very briefly, this is the kind of method slide. Sample size, field updates, and then specifically by millennials, I mean 25 to 40-year-olds. There's no consistent definition of what a millennial is, but for our poll, we used that 15-year age bracket. Firstly, I think it's worth establishing why we care what millennials think about anything. The thing that struck me is just how many of us there are. I say us, I'm 28, so I'm in that. in that bucket. So yeah, about a quarter of the adult population. The fun thing is mapping this. So they're quite a geographically efficient coalition. If they're a political party, they win a majority. About 324 seats. That is where millennials are the largest of those generational cohorts. So worth caring about. The title there, hidden, says, do millennials want more discussion around economics or culture? And we've asked similar questions to this in earlier polls, in earlier work. And you get a very similar age gradient to this kind of question. Older groups want to talk more about economics, less about cultural issues. And younger groups, looking at millennials here, in the red bar, want to talk more about culture and less about economics. So that's their stated preference. But when we look at questions like this, they're kind of fairly typical. What are the top issues facing Britain today? Select your top 3 in order. The thing that strikes me is just how much millennials care about taxation, followed by housing, and much less about cultural issues like immigration, also crime, also Brexit. This red box sticking out there shows how different millennials' priorities are compared to the average, and how economically focused they are compared to older voters that really get concerned about immigration. What follows are a bunch of slides that kind of hammer home this point. This one is questions on housing versus environment and climate change. We see that millennials care quite a lot about, well, they worry about affordable housing. They think housing is a top issue, way more than boomers do. And on climate change, there's actually a slightly, say, upward gradient. So older voters are slightly more likely to say they are concerned about climate change and think that it's a top issue facing the country. I think one of the reasons for this is not that millennials don't care about the environment, but their view tends to be, meh, I've got other things to like worry about, things like housing, things like jobs, and that pushes concerns like environmental issues, social issues, down in the ranking. We ran a max diff experiment where we asked voters from a list of 40 policies. You get shown a screen of 5, and you pick your favorite and least favorite from that list of 5. That lets us work out the likelihood of someone having a strong enough view on one of those 2 of those 5 options to pick that as the best or worst. The rest are meh, somewhere in the middle. This shows the gap between millennials and the rest of our sample. They are more likely to pick as their most favorite or least favorite policy policies in the kind of childcare bucket, education bucket, housing, but also the economy, more than the rest of our sample. And they are much less interested in immigration, marginally less interested in the environment, which we saw earlier. And this final bucket of, I've called culture, it includes policies like removing statues of controversial historical figures, those kind of culture war policies, you could say. Much less interested, for or against, they don't really care. The next thing I want to talk about is a similar kind of tension in the millennial mindset, which is the difference between general values on the economy versus some more specific issues on economics. This here is what you often find with these kind of economic questions is an age gradient that's fairly clear. Younger people tend to be slightly more left-leaning on their values. Is your position in society your own effort or outside your control? Should the government focus more on equality or growth? These 2 questions track fairly closely. The funny thing is, the next graph, which is asking questions about the economy, redistribute incomes from the better off to those who are worse off. Do businesses provide opportunities or do they exploit people? And the pattern's very different. You've got a very linear line here, and then this kind of other shape where millennials, this is the peak here, the sort of 25 to 40 bracket are actually more right-leaning than the typical person. They're about as right-wing as boomers in this question. There isn't much difference. And that gives rise to this final graph here, which takes those two and plots them on a scatter graph. So on the bottom, the x-axis here, you have the values question on equality versus growth. And on the y, we've got redistribute income to the worse off or keep my own tax money. And millennials are in this kind of top left quadrant. They like equality, but also don't want to have their money taken away from them to give to poor people. And that is a unique combination of values. Generation Z are consistently left-wing, and boomers and silent generation, those even older, are consistently centre-right on both these issues. There is another piece, perhaps for the future, about what is going on with Generation X. But for now, millennials have a weird combination of centre-left values, but are more centre-right on specific issues around tax or businesses. And we've called them, maybe you can't see it there, but like shy capitalists because of this. So summing up, this is a summing up slide. So the millennials have the same broadly similar core issues to the rest of the electorate, with particular emphasis on housing and jobs. And they care less about social, cultural issues, cultural immigration, than you might think from their stated preference of talk more about this stuff and talk less about economics. And then their mix of centre-left values, but centre-right on specific issues makes them broadly what we call shy capitalists. And so if you're designing a policy offering for millennials, what you would probably do is mix the substance and the signals. So talking about equality, but delivering on a kind of slightly lower tax agenda. Thank you, and I shall stop there.
Another really fascinating presentation in your material, because we're a little bit more on time now as well. And then we're going to go to Joel, who's going to take us through understanding the Red Wall from 2019 to today. Yes. Over to you, Joel. Also from it.
Yes. I will start by apologising. I think I'm the only presenter here who doesn't work in politics day to day. At Ipsos, I'm in public affairs, but I work in education, child and early years policy. So it's a little bit different. You'll probably see there's a bit of a difference because I have a few more pictures and text and less graphs, which is a slight rookie mistake, but well. I thought I'd just explain a little bit why I'm talking about this, which is my background. I did my master's here at LSE, and I focused on why the Red Wall fell, but specifically a niche within the research that hadn't necessarily been covered, which was Red Wall voters that stayed Labour. And that's really what kind of, I'm not presenting on that now, but that's kind of my expertise around this field, because I had to do a lot of studying of the polling data on people that switched from Labour to Conservative. Just to go on to brief topics around what is the Red Wall and why is it red. I assume most of you have heard what the Red Wall is, but just to say it is a large block of historically Labour voting constituencies that runs along the north of England and Wales. It fell in 2019 for the first time, which allowed for the Conservatives to gain their largest majority since 1987, and slightly more importantly, caused Labour to fall to its weakest position in almost 100 years. So it was a very significant political event in 2019. And that's really why I want to talk about it in relation to the next general election. Just to say, why was the Red Wall red? Kanagasorium was the one who coined this term, and he originally defined the Red Wall as paradoxically Labour, despite the fact that demographically, Red Wall seats represent often most likely places that would be overwhelmingly Conservative. They still were Labour. So there was a cultural, historical tie to Labour that caused them to be the Red Wall prior to 2019. And I'll add, though, that there has been research since, specifically thinking of a YouGov piece in 2021 that looked at how actually there's some parts of the original definition of the Red Wall that aren't that different from the rest of the UK. Specifically, the Red Wall is not particularly more socially conservative than other places. It's not more patriotic than other places. So why did the Red Wall fall? Apologies, yeah, a lot of text. So this is breaking it down into 4 key reasons. I like to think of it more so as like short-term causes and long-term causes. The most immediate causes for why the Red Wall fell was because of the leadership and Brexit. These aren't necessarily too different compared to the rest of the country, but it is true that polling and research shows that Boris was very popular in the Red Wall, and that Brexit was especially an important issue in the Red Wall. There's a high correlation between Red Wall seats that overwhelmingly voted to leave in 2016 and ones that voted Conservative in 2019. So there was definitely a strong correlation. On the more long-term reasons why the Red Wall fell, the first one was around leaving the political establishment, which might not make sense. This is from Deborah Mattison's book, Beyond the Red Wall, which is relevant because she's the head of strategy for Keir Starmer currently. In her book, she looks at the Red Wall and specifically on long-term issues there. And despite the fact that the Conservatives have been in power nationally, in the Red Wall, it had always been Labour locally. And so a lot of people reported that they wanted to protest against the current political establishment by voting Conservative, which also fed into their perceptions of Boris Johnson as an anti-establishment figure. And lastly, one of the biggest long-term kind of motivations for why so many people changed from Labour to Conservative was related to this idea that Labour no longer represents people in the Red Wall, which it relates directly to the presentation prior. Labour voters are stereotyped as younger, as cosmopolitan city dwellers, highly educated, which doesn't represent people in the Red Wall. And these are people who are older, 50 plus, educated to compulsory level, oftentimes do come from backgrounds of industrial or mining communities, which led to a kind of a disalignment between the electoral communities that are now most at play in politics now. Yes, and I will say at the bottom, that's from the British election study of 2019. Some graphs. So how blue is the Red Wall now? I think it goes without saying in relation to everything that's been discussed, Conservatives are projected to lose almost all Red Wall seats in the next general election, and it's not certain, but Labour are set to win most back. My main sources for polling on the Red Wall specifically are from Redfield and Wilson and JL Partners. There's not a large pool of research that is recent and looks specifically at the Red Wall. But even just comparing the most recent October poll with Ipsos's most recent October poll, you can see that there is a smaller margin. There's 16% margin between the Conservatives and Labour in the Red Wall. And interestingly, the Conservatives still have more sway, seemingly, with 32% compared to 24%, which in comparison to Politico and YouGov is kind of the middle ground. I think Politico had the Conservatives at 27%, and I think YouGov was 21%. But so it's interesting that Conservatives seem to have more sway, and there seems to be more of a battle between the Conservatives and Labour in the Red Wall compared to other places. I think it's also important to factor in the recent local elections in May. Labour did well, but it wasn't as well as it could have done in the Red Wall. And there's a few cases of, I think there was Stoke-on-Trent and Blackpool they won back, but there were other places like Bassett Law, which are deep Red Wall seats that they didn't. So it was a mixed bag, which could mean that there's maybe less room for Conservatives, but more room for the Reform Party or Green Party to take power. So will the Red Wall rise again? And it's a slightly, the question there is also interesting because we won't really know until after the next general election if there's any kind of Red Wall left. Because it kind of disintegrated in 2019, we don't know if these people will vote in a unified way again, just to say that. But if I was going to go back on the same issues that were very important in 2019 now, leadership, In the red wall, no politician is particularly popular. I think that's evident from the other presentations as well. But if you look at the JL Partners poll from March, that showed that it was that Keir Starmer was slightly less unpopular than Sunak. Brexit is a mixed bag. It seems that polls that have done on the red wall show that the Conservatives have seemed to do better on Brexit, but Brexit is not as salient an issue for them. It's the economy, first and foremost, and then immigration. And so how well the Conservatives are doing on Brexit might not be as important as how well they're perceived to be doing on the economy. Leaving the political establishment, and this is, there's some pieces on this, this is less evident from the polling, but the Conservatives have been in power locally and nationally now. So the next general election, red wall voters aren't going to be protesting against the current political establishment by voting Conservative. That's just common sense, really. But it also seems like there isn't, you know, there's not Boris Johnson to kind of whip that into shape either. Yeah. And lastly, Labour no longer represents people like me. So this is something that is definitely still at play, and I think it affects the perception of Keir, perception of Labour, and has led to these mixed results. In the JL Partners poll from March, it was quite interesting that there's polling questions done on how much you trust a political party that show that the Conservatives, well, Labour is distrusted, not more so than the Conservatives, but also it feels like people there feel like Labour also respects their communities, which is quite an interesting contrast to compare. And just lastly, on any emergent issues that weren't there in 2019, the main thing which has been said multiple times is the Conservative Party no longer seen as the most economically competent party, and that bears out in the most recent polls in the red wall, and that is a very significant difference. The cost of living crisis has hit the red wall particularly hard. There was a recent analysis done by Outro in collaboration with the Vulnerability Registration Service, which showed that Labour won, Conservative held red wall seats have some of the highest levels of financial vulnerability in the country. And you also factor in these places are bolstered by regional equality. That's definitely going to be a factor for these red wall voters. Broken promises from 2019 elections, specifically related to levelling up, are going to be on red wall voters' minds, especially something as national as HS2 cancellation. That's going to be a big factor for red wall voters who rely on transport. And lastly, an issue that wasn't necessarily there in 2019 is this hesitancy around what Labour stands for, what Keir Starmer stands for, and the new direction of the party. There's been a lot of research since 2019 that's shown that people aren't necessarily certain of what Labour is anymore, which is something that will probably bear out in the next election. That was all me.
Yeah.
Thanks a bunch.